Andy Burkowski here for VGS. Earlier today, I made a video about the ending of Resident Evil Village. It was centered around debunking a screenshot that suggested that Ethan Winters, our main character, who's heroically sacrificed himself at the end of the game, was in fact alive, and the man walking beside the Jeep that Rose is during the epilogue. The screenshot didn't look realistic. There was a lot of reasons not to believe it. But unfortunately, I was incorrect. After doing some sleuthing and some editing of game files myself, there is some pretty substantial proof that the man who is seen walking beside that Jeep is in fact the character model of Ethan Winters, as you can see here. What that means for the actual game and the lore inside, I think is still up for interpretation. I don't necessarily think that is, him now in the moldy flesh alive, but if you were wondering who that person was walking beside the Jeep in the epilogue, here it is. It is his character model that is beside him, and maybe the next DLC will open up with this exact moment when it does happen. Likely it's a hallucination that Rose is seeing, but there is still a lot here that I want to talk about what the ending could be moving forward, what the game will choose to do with Ethan Winters. So even if this isn't really him, here are some ways that Ethan could return in the next iteration of Resident Evil. I want to start with a quick primer about the ending and how it relates to the lore within Resident Evil. So we learned that Ethan Winters, our main protagonist in the last two games, actually died at the beginning of Resident Evil 7 when Jack Baker kicked his head in with his super mold powers. The understanding is that at that moment, Ethan regenerated because he was within this magical mold thanks to the infection first set out by Evelyn and then through the Baker family. So the 3 years that followed those events, he was living in this kind of quasi-undead state, much more effectively than the Baker family and other people who are affected by mold. So effectively, he was even able to consummate and have a child, which is a little interesting to think about. But once that revelation was told to him by Evelyn, after he was killed by Miranda near the end of the game, Ethan, accepting his fate, used these powers to attack and finally kill Miranda before deciding that as he begins to desiccate and disintegrate, that he will sacrifice himself and walk into that maelstrom, blowing himself up while protecting the life of his daughter. It's cool to look back and see some of the hints that Capcom had left in the series that Ethan was actually dead. Even that first line when Jack says, "Welcome to the family," and then he becomes infected just like the Baker family did. But in Resident Evil Village, we have moments where Alcinia, the tall lady, gets a taste of Ethan and says his blood is stale. Even her daughters keep calling him a man thing, which is ironic because that is what he is, neither a man nor a thing. And then after he is reincarnated, there are also some key lines from the Duke, who mentions that Ethan's life will change going forward, that it will be a little bit different. Now, that change and that wording, I think, is very, very important because I think that gives an indication of where the game might be going. So understanding the background lore will give you a real key to what will likely happen. In Resident Evil Village, the main push of the game is Miranda trying to bring back the life of her daughter who died over 100 years ago. While she's grieving the life of her daughter that was lost, she discovers an entity known as the Megamycete. This being, this creature, this entity, I think it really is the best way to describe it, contains a hive mind of consciousnesses. These thoughts, these feelings, these people are all preserved within. And that's the reason that Miranda tried to do various different experiments and procedures to find the consciousness of her daughter. And in Resident Evil 8, she believed that she needed a vessel, one that could house the power of this being and still survived. She attempted experiments through something called a Cadou parasite, giving this mold and this megamycete being's juices to this parasite that then infects people. It only worked on a few select special individuals that became the lords and bosses within this world. But Rose, she believed, would be a good vessel because she seemingly had a connection to this mold. And if you're confused what the mold is, basically it is the magical fungus, the infecting type of the megamycete. The megamycete is the power source. The mold is the means for infection. So if Miranda believed that Rose had the ability to control the mold and operate within it, and possibly even grab the consciousness of one who is within it, what does that mean for Ethan? We know that Ethan was infected years and years ago and still survived, and we also know that those within the mold eventually get their consciousness connected to the megamycete, and we know that Rose seemingly has more power to influence and change it even than Evelyn did in Resident Evil 7. So it is very likely to assume that within the DLC or within the upcoming game, Rose, while communicating with the mold and the megamycete, will attempt to either revive the consciousness of her long-dead father, or perhaps speak to it, similar to what we saw Evelyn do to Ethan near the end of Resident Evil 8. So I think they've set up all the building blocks to make this make sense. How it's going to be implemented, though, I'm not sure. But if Rose is even more powerful with this magical material than Evelyn is, then why wouldn't this be a connection? We heard before from Capcom that this is a trilogy about Ethan Winters. The father's story is done, but I don't think that means his role will now be limited. I think there's space here for him to return because of what we've seen with this lore. And though the interesting thing will be if Rose will go down in infamy like Miranda did, if the plot is centered around Rose making those same choices to try to bring back her father and becoming more and more evil. Maybe we'll have Chris shooting Rose in the head at the end of Resident Evil 9. I don't know how it'll work, but I do think that it's very likely this will be the continuation of the plot. And there's another theory that if you look into some of the concept art for Resident Evil Village, we see a character that Resident Evil fans will be very familiar with. Ada Wong was supposed to play a role. Apparently, she was supposed to actually save Ethan's life in some of the earlier versions of this draft of the game in her really cool kind of witch hunter outfit. Could it be possible that Ethan Winters will be revived by this returning character? Maybe she didn't make the cut for the full game, but will be in the next DLC or even in the next iteration. Either way, it's good to know that this Ethan Winters at the end is clearly meant to be him. It's his character model. You can see that both of his hands have one decaying and one hurt from near the end of the game. The question, though, is this central to the plot, or is this just a cool Easter egg for people to find? I think it's really up to your interpretation. If I was a betting man, I think that this is maybe just a cool Easter egg. I would put my money on Rose starting the DLC right from that moment, and we see a quick flash of Ethan, but then nothing after that. That's what I think will happen. What do you think? What do you know? We finally have some proof that this is Ethan Winters. I'd love to know how you feel about it. Andy Burkowski for VGS.